Hey guys, today we're looking at the HL content for section 4.1, Benefits of International Trade, which is specifically about absolute and comparative advantage. You've already learnt about some of the benefits of international trade, so hopefully that let you refresh your memory a little bit. Here, we're just looking at it in a more precise way when countries will benefit from trade. We'll look at absolute advantage first. Absolute advantage occurs when a country can produce more of a good or service than another country using the same amount of resources. To explore the concepts, we're going to simplify reality greatly by looking at two countries, Australia and China, and assume that each only produces two goods, iron ore and cloth. Australia can produce 9 million tonnes of iron ore or 4 million tonnes of cloth, or a combination in between these values. We assume that both countries have the same resources. Therefore, we can see that Australia has the absolute advantage in producing iron ore. China has the absolute advantage in producing cloth. Using the same resources, Australia makes more iron and China makes more cloth. We can also calculate the opportunity cost for each country of making 1 tonne of iron ore. That is, what is each country giving up per tonne of iron ore? This will be useful later. So we'll plug in this equation. So what this is really saying is that the opportunity cost of 1 more tonne of iron ore equals the total amount of cloth possible divided by the total amount of iron ore possible. So for Australia, the opportunity cost of 1 more tonne of iron ore is 4 over 9, because they can make 4 million tonnes of cloth, 9 million of iron ore. So the opportunity cost of 1 tonne of iron ore is 0.44 tonnes of cloth. Okay, and let's see how you do with China. Good. That should be pretty straightforward, really. There we go. So this chart, it shows production possibilities, right? So we're going to draw PPCs. We must remember here that this assumes constant opportunity cost. The PPCs will be straight lines rather than the bowed out curves, you will remember. Stop here and plot these using straight lines on one PPC diagram, just to test if you remember how. Just put iron ore up on the y-axis, cloth on the x-axis. Okay, here they are. Now, we know that there is reciprocal absolute advantage because the two PPCs intersect each other. Let's have a look at how much each country might produce and consume with closed economies, no trade. Okay, for ease, we'll assume half of each country's resources are going to each good. So Australia, 4.5 million tonnes of iron, 2 million tonnes of cloth, China, 3 million tonnes of each. Okay, of course, each country could produce at any point on or within their PPC. Now we want to see the benefits of trade. So now we'll look at how much will be produced if they each specialise according to their absolute advantage. Australia would make 9 tonnes of iron ore and no cloth, and China would make no iron, 6 million tonnes of cloth. How do they know how much to trade each good for? Think back to opportunity cost. Australia must receive more than 0.44 tonnes, I should say tonnes, 0.44 tonnes of cloth for a tonne of iron, otherwise they might as well make it themselves. And China need to give up less than 1 tonne of cloth to get a tonne of iron. Why would they trade 1 tonne of cloth for 1 tonne of iron when that is their local opportunity cost? Doesn't make sense. We'll go somewhere in the middle and say that 1 tonne of iron equals 0.75 tonnes of cloth. Hopefully you can see it there behind my face. Okay, so they're trading. Australia trades away 3 million tonnes of iron and receives 2.25 million tonnes of cloth. It is vital to note that this is a better deal for Australia than being closed. In the closed economy, foregoing 3 tonnes of iron would have only gained them 1.32 tonnes of cloth. China trades away 2.25 million tonnes of cloth and receives 3 million tonnes of iron. Again, this is a better return than they could have expected by rearranging their local production. Both countries have gained from trade. This is reflected in the total consumption. Look, they're producing more than they were before, and each country is now operating outside of its own PPC. This is something that's not possible without trade. Now consider another set of data, France and Poland making wine and cheese. If we again assume that they have the same quantity of resources, we see that France has absolute advantage in wine. They can make 3 litres, while Poland can only make 1. And also in cheese, where they make 4 kilos compared to Poland's 3. Now, immediately you might think, France is better at making both. Why would they trade? And that's a perfectly reasonable question, but the answer lies in comparative advantage. A country has comparative advantage if it can produce the good at a lower opportunity cost than another country. We can work this out. Okay, so here's how it's represented on the diagram. We can see they don't intersect each other, so they don't have the reciprocal absolute advantage. Okay, we can work out these opportunity costs. I've done the first one for you, but let's see if we can get the other ones. Okay, hopefully you got these answers. That would be good. Okay, we've derived them using the formula that the opportunity cost of 1 more unit of good A is equal to the total amount of good B possible, divided by the total amount of good A possible. So we see that France has comparative advantage in making wine. Right, it's less. And we see that Poland actually has comparative advantage in making cheese. Now, there is a trick to tell from a glance from the PPC, which country has which good the country has comparative advantage in. The stronger nation, France, has comparative advantage of the good with the largest gap between PPCs. So if we're looking at this, we can tell France has comparative advantage in wine because it's got the larger gap here. This will always hold, so you can use it as a bit of a double check. And also, given this, we can surmise that when the PPCs are parallel to each other, there is no comparative advantage at all, and therefore no benefit from them trading with each other. Okay, let's have a look at how much each country might produce and consume with closed economies again, no trade. So we'll assume again that they're making half, they're using half resources for each thing. So France will make 1.5 litres of wine, 2 kilos of cheese, which is half of these numbers, of course. And as we know, each country could produce within its PPC. Now, if they specialise, France makes all the wine, Poland makes all the cheese, if they specialise with their comparative advantage. So then we're going to show you how they're better off by trading with each other. So how much do they trade for? Again, we have to think about the opportunity cost. France need to receive more than 1.33 kilos of cheese for a litre of wine, otherwise they might as well do it themselves. And Poland need to give up less than 3 kilos of cheese for a bottle of wine, otherwise, or for a litre of wine, because otherwise they should do it themselves as well. So we'll go somewhere in the middle and say that 1 litre of wine is traded for 2 kilos of cheese. Okay, so they are trading now. France trades 1 litre of wine to get 2 kilos of cheese. Right? So they made 3 litres of wine, they sold 1 to get the cheese. Okay, so now we can see that they are consuming more than they could before. The total consumption is more. And we can see that both countries, again, are consuming outside of their PPCs, which, of course, is impossible without trade. Okay. Now we're going to look at the sources of comparative advantage. It's often based on a country's endowments, how well endowed a country is. So Australia has a large amount of grazing land, so that makes us good at doing things like producing beef, right? That's just an example. China has a large amount of unskilled labor, so that makes them likely to have a comparative advantage in manufacturing that uses unskilled labor, so labor-intensive manufacturing. Singapore has a highly educated labor force. that's likely to give them a comparative advantage in something like financial services. Now, comparative advantage has its limitations. So this is the guy that came up with it, David Ricardo, is a Dutch economist. Since he spread this theory, it's been instrumental in creating more trade throughout the world and getting those benefits that we saw. But it's not perfect. It's got some limitations and we might need to evaluate those. So firstly, perfect knowledge is assumed in this model. Both producers and consumers know where they can buy goods for the least amount of money. Countries know what their comparative advantage is relative to other countries. This is a big assumption, and so it does limit the real life usefulness of the theory. We might also note that transport costs were ignored in our earlier analysis. It can be expensive to shift bottles of wine around the world. And the more the transport costs, the more it diminishes the benefits of specializing in one product. Does the real world have two countries that only each produce two goods? No. So that's a little bit unrealistic. But economists now use computer simulations to include multiple countries and multiple products in their analyses. There was also no trade protection mentioned in the examples. So once you factor in that Poland has, say, a 50% tariff on imported wine, it might not be so advantageous for the countries to specialize. And while it may hold that commodities are equal, that is, price should be the only determining factor as to whether Australia buys oil from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia, this doesn't hold for all goods. They're not homogeneous, they're not the same. Consider computers. One country may make them cheaper, but if the quality differs, can we really claim that this country has comparative advantage? Not really. We also see that capital and labour are going to move frequently between countries. Labour migrates often from low wage to high wage countries. For example, an Afghani may migrate to Australia and send wages home to support their family, or a multinational company. They may invest their capital machinery in a developing country to produce the good there. This implies that the comparative advantages are not static, they are going to change over time. Also, full employment doesn't really happen. In our analysis, we saw the economies operating on the PPC, indicating that all available resources were being utilised. Also, specialisation is not always the best option for a country. A strong comparative advantage may make it seem that a country should almost completely specialise in one good. The problem is that this leaves the country very vulnerable. If the world price for this good, usually a commodity, falls, the entire economy can fall over. This is a particular risk for developing countries, and we'll look at that later. Lastly, imports and exports do not balance neatly. We've seen that all this trading is very clean and everyone wins. This is not always the case. Many countries import much more than they export. Okay, a full discussion on comparative advantage should ideally be taken in arguments that you have already learnt about the pros and cons of trade and stuff that we will continue to learn. Okay, make sure you fully understand this, and we'll go through some exercises in class to really nail it down. Thanks.